Okay, so this video is going to be all about practicing, specifically practicing drawing. And in this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to get more out of your drawing practice. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first tip is going to be eye-hand warm-ups. You've probably seen me make videos about these before, but I recommend doing some figure drawing, either to warm up or to wind down at the end of the day. I find that drawing from short model poses really kind of helps loosen you up. So 30-second to a minute poses. You could do these at a real-life figure drawing session, or if you don't have access to something like that, you can use one of the YouTube videos that I've recommended in past videos, or you could just look at a photograph and set a timer to it. This just helps you loosen up before you embark on something more finished. I would recommend looking more at the subject that you're drawing rather than the marks that you're putting down. This will help you with your observational skills, and it'll also help you with storing enough information so that when it comes time to drawing from your imagination, you just have more of an accurate imagination. I put this as the #1 tip just because I think it's a really great place to start. Drawing from real life really will help your drawing ultimately when you're drawing from your head. And as it pertains to practicing drawing, this will help you not only with your observational skills, but obviously your anatomy and figure drawing skills as well. And for comics and illustration, that stuff is invaluable. Okay, tip #2 is copying. Copying is not always a bad thing, especially as it pertains to practicing. You definitely don't want to be doing this for your professional work, but when you're practicing and trying to learn, copying can be really, really helpful. A really good way to figure out how something was made is essentially to take it apart and try to put it back together again. So that's kind of what you're doing when you're copying something. You're sort of putting yourself in the mindset of the artist whose work you admire and trying to figure out how they went about constructing that image. This is actually a tip that I didn't always implement in my own drawing practice, but I then saw a video by an artist that I really admire named Steve Rude, and there's a video of him going through his sketchbooks, and he was showing all the instances where he literally copied like Jack Kirby panels or stills from Disney animated movies, whatever it might be, and he explained how much he gets out of literally redrawing images that he admires so much. It goes back to that whole deconstructing and putting it back together kind of thing. So like I said, I don't always implement this into my drawing practice, but every time I do, I realize that I actually learn a lot from it and that I probably should do it more often. So if you're already in the habit of copying as a drawing practice, awesome. If you haven't tried it before, definitely give it a shot. It might work for you. Okay, tip #3 is connect the dots. So by connecting the dots, I mean if you have trouble drawing hands or feet or any part of the body, for instance, instead of like trying to isolate hands and just draw a bunch of hands on a sheet of paper, although that can be very helpful, I found that for me, understanding how a hand works is much better to draw it as it relates to the rest of the body. So for hands, for instance, I draw it attached to an arm, or I'll draw it attached to the whole figure, maybe draw the hand outstretched in front of the face, or whatever it might be. It just helps me kind of understand the anatomy of one particular body part when I could kind of understand it more as it relates to the whole of the body. So for instance, for me, I find it really hard to this day to draw shoes. Any kind of footwear is actually really difficult for me to draw. And so when I try to isolate those things and practice them, I find it to be a little bit more difficult, and it becomes, I could kind of understand it more when I draw a shoe on someone, for instance. I could figure out perhaps how to draw shoes better, but then I eventually have to figure out how a shoe works on someone. So I will, for instance, I will just draw a figure and make sure that the figure has shoes on. And maybe how the figure is stepping off or jumping or just walking normally, because most of the time you're probably not just going to be drawing shoes isolated without someone in them. So same thing with a hand or any other part of the body that is problematic. So that's why I call it connecting the dots. Pretty much rather than isolating a certain area, drawing it as it relates to the rest of the body. Okay, so tip number 4 is going to be instructional books. Instructional books are great. I think I've made some videos on here where I've recommended some of my favorite art instructional books. The thing about books like this is that they're not books that you just kind of sit down and read like you would any other kind of book. They're books that you really have to put into practice. So I would recommend when you open up one of these books to have a piece of paper and pencil with you. It's really important to kind of draw along with the exercises as you're sort of reading it. It's a lot of like figuring it out as you go. When I first started picking up drawing books, I kind of assumed that the more I would just kind of read this stuff, I would absorb sort of this knowledge and just become a better artist. I know that sounds stupid and silly, but it really clicked when I realized, oh, wait, I have to actually put these things into practice. I sort of think of these books almost like language books. So for instance, if you wanted to learn a new language like Spanish, you can read a how to speak Spanish book and maybe absorb a little bit, but the way you're really going to learn how to speak Spanish is by speaking Spanish, being around people who are speaking Spanish and having that kind of conversation back and forth. Drawing is really similar, especially with things like perspective. There's a lot of really great perspective books out there. So many of them are really intimidating. Anytime I open up a book on perspective, it's like math. It kind of brings me back to my school days, and math was always really difficult for me. So I see a lot of like grids and lines and numbers, and it kind of freaks me out. But I've realized that if I really just take it step by step and draw these things out as I'm learning it, it starts to make more sense. And speaking of perspective books, I'll try to put a link down below if I can remember. I recently came across a really awesome book on perspective, and it was, for me, the one that kind of like clicked. It really made a lot of sense. The examples in there were really clear, and the artist who wrote the book really kind of like explained it in a way that it felt like he was talking to artists. So I will put it down below and check it out if you want to. I can't remember the name right now, but it's a really great book. One other thing about working from instructional books is that you could kind of jump around. It's not like reading a novel or anything like that. A lot of times in the beginning, they go over very basic, rudimentary things. And if you're already sort of past that, it's fine to sort of jump ahead and pick the things that you need the most help with. Some books that I have, I only really like them because there is one really great chapter in them. These kind of books are like that though. You kind of just pick and choose the most helpful parts out of all of them. That's why oftentimes a lot of artists have a ton of art books, just because there's a little bit in this one that's really helpful, or there's a little bit in this one that's really helpful. And let me know in the comments below if you actually have any recommendations for some really good instructional art books that you like. I'm always kind of on the hunt for these things. But you know, there's so many out there, and some are amazing and some are not so amazing. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. I'd appreciate it. Okay, and the last tip, tip number 5, I call learning on the job. So let me explain. Sometimes throwing yourself into the deep end and setting out to do a really complicated, ambitious illustration that involves all the things that are challenging for you. I feel like sometimes that could kind of accelerate your learning a little bit. So for instance, if perspective is challenging for you, maybe set out to do a really elaborate drawing of Spider-Man, you know, flying through New York City from like a worm's eye view perspective or something like that. So the reason why I say to set out to make it like a finished illustration is sometimes when you get out of the head of actually practicing and just put yourself into, okay, I'm going to make this the best drawing I can. And if perspective is tough, then I'm going to have to figure out perspective while I'm working on this drawing. I found that even in teaching, some of my students work best when there's like time is running out, right, on an assignment and their back is up against the wall. Sometimes for some of us creative people, that's when all that stuff kind of comes out that you didn't even know that you had. And if you set out to do something that is really complicated or involves things that are tricky for you and you fall short, that's fine, and in some ways that's kind of expected, but that is also how you learn. In years to come, this might be kind of a cringy drawing to look back on, but it can also be the drawing that kind of sets the wheels in motion. Alright, so there are my 5 tips. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. I hope this helps improve your practicing as it relates to drawing. If you have any tips for what makes you practice drawing better, leave them in the comments down below. I know I'm all ears. I'd love to hear them, and I'm sure anyone else watching this video would get something out of it as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.